The last customer had left hours ago, but the comforting scent of garlic and rosemary still lingered in the air of La Tavola di Nonno, my small Italian bistro tucked into a quiet street corner. I wiped down the aged wooden tables, each nick and scratch a silent witness to the past year's uphill battle. Tomorrow was supposed to be our final day of service, or so my parents believed. My name is Sophia Romano, and at 32, I was about to reveal the final course in a revenge years in the making. Not bitter, but rich and warm, just like Nonno's coffee. Still clinging to this fantasy? My mother's sharp voice pierced the silence like a knife sliding through fresh focaccia. She stood at the doorway in a designer coat that screamed old money, flanked by my father in an equally loud suit. Together, they looked like royalty visiting the ruins of a failed peasant dream. Their chain of upscale steakhouses had made them a fortune, but it had cost them their soul. "We came to make one last offer," my father said, pulling out his checkbook like a magician about to perform a vanishing act. 50,000 to pay off your debts. You shut this place down and come work for us. Like you should have from the start. I kept my hands moving, wiping the table with slow precision, hiding the smirk tugging at the edge of my lips. If only they knew. If only they had a clue about what Nonno, my grandfather, had whispered to me over a quiet dinner 3 months ago. My mother drifted a finger across a nearby table, inspecting it like a judge at a failing food competition. The health inspector's report was very clear. This place is a code violation waiting to happen. You're lucky we even want to help. What they didn't realize was that the failed health inspection had been part of a very deliberate plan. Just like the rumors of financial trouble, just like the sudden cancellations, all pieces on a chessboard moved with precision, not panic. At least say something, Sophia, my dad urged, growing impatient. I looked up at them, then toward the kitchen. Would you like a cup of Nonno's blend? I asked politely. My mom rolled her eyes. Still serving that bitter old brew? No wonder this place is a failure. Restaurants today need innovation, not nostalgia. You're right, I said calmly, walking into the kitchen. Innovation like frozen steaks and microwave truffle sauce. Our restaurants make money, my dad snapped. Which is more than I can say for this hobby of yours. I emerged with the old hammered copper coffee pot, Nonno's favorite, and 3 small ceramic cups. The same pot he'd used for 4 decades in the original La Tavola, the restaurant he built from nothing and passed down, or rather, was pressured into selling to them. Remember this? I asked as I poured the steaming coffee. Nonno used to say the secret isn't in the beans, it's in the memories. Sentimental drivel, my mother muttered, but she accepted the cup anyway. They both did. They never could resist Nonno's blend. Speaking of your grandfather, my dad said between sips, the estate attorney called. The will's being read tomorrow morning. I don't know why you're even listed. You made your choice when you walked away from the family business. I simply nodded. I didn't need to argue. Nonno had taught me long ago that in business and in revenge, timing is everything. You know, my mother added casually, setting down her empty cup. He was always so disappointed in you. Wasting your summers in his kitchen, learning outdated techniques when you could have studied real management. The lies stung, but I didn't flinch. I remembered his words too clearly. Let them believe they've won, Piccolina. Let them gloat. Then you serve the truth hot or cold, as the moment demands. The offer expires tomorrow, my dad said firmly. After that, you'll be on your own. When the bank takes this place, you'll wish you'd taken our help. They turned and left, the little brass bell on the door ringing one last time. I waited until the sound faded and their car had disappeared down the block before moving to the kitchen. Behind a stack of flour sacks was a hidden safe. I turned the dial and opened it. Inside was a thick envelope and a letter I had already memorized. My dearest Sophia, by the time you read this, everything should be in motion. Your parents understand profits, but they never understood people. They took my restaurant and turned it into a machine. They won't do the same to you. I've watched you this past year. The way you care for every plate, every guest, every detail. You are my true heir, not in blood alone, but in spirit. Inside this envelope is the truth about this business, about our plan, and about what happens next. Let them believe you failed. Let them gloat. Then, my dear, serve them the truth. With love, Nonno. Giovanni opened the envelope and scanned the documents one last time. Property deeds, financial statements, signed contracts. Everything he'd built, now in my hands. Every cancelled reservation had already been rescheduled for the grand reopening next month. But first, tomorrow, had to happen just as he'd choreographed it. I spent the night prepping like it was my first day in the kitchen. The osso buco needed to marinate. The pasta had to be rolled by hand. Every herb was hand-picked. Every sauce simmered slow. Near dawn, I changed into my chef's whites, pressed and perfect. I lit the burners and set the table at the front window, Nano's favorite spot. The copper pot gleamed under the morning sun, catching the first light like a beacon. Tomorrow was not the end. It was the beginning. By 7:30 a.m., the scent of slow-cooked tomato sauce, fresh rosemary, and Nano's coffee filled the kitchen of La Tavola di Nano. Every surface gleamed, every prep bowl was arranged with surgical precision. The dining room was already half full, not with walk-ins, but with carefully curated guests who were all part of the plan. Friends of Nano, loyal regulars, quiet investors, even retired chefs he'd mentored years ago. They were all here not for a farewell, but for a beginning. At 8 a.m. the place was packed. All 18 tables reserved, though my parents believed no one wanted to eat at a dying restaurant. My mother and father arrived at 8:30 on the dot, dressed like they were headed to a stockholder meeting, not a local caf. My father's silver cufflinks sparkled. My mother's handbag probably cost more than my monthly food inventory. Full house? My mother quipped, scanning the dining room with a raised brow. Charity cases, I assume? No, I said warmly, just regulars, people who remember. Nano's way of cooking. My father grunted and gestured toward the table near the front window, the one where Nano used to sit, drink his espresso, and chat with guests. I had saved it for them. Coffee? I offered, already reaching for the copper pot. Might as well, my father muttered. One last cup before the wrecking ball arrives. I poured with the same flourish Nano had taught me. The rich, dark liquid flowed like ritual into delicate porcelain cups. The aroma swirled between us: cinnamon, dark roast, citrus. My mother hesitated, then brought the cup to her lips. For just a moment, her expression softened. Something flickered in her eyes. A memory, maybe. Your grandfather used to brew this every morning, she said quietly. In the old days, before we changed the menu, before the renovations. You mean before you turned his trattoria into a chain steakhouse? I replied, voice neutral. My father chuckled dismissively. We made it profitable. That's what matters. I said nothing. Profit was their gospel, but Nano had worshipped something else entirely. Legacy. They turned to their phones, swiping through spreadsheets and stock updates while I slipped away to greet guests. Each handshake, each smile was a silent act of rebellion. My parents thought this was the restaurant's last hurrah, but the guests knew better. Each person in that room had been carefully invited as part of Nano's final plan. At 9:45, the front door opened, and Marco stepped inside, his black jacket dusted with flour. He looked like he'd just come from the bakery. He had, in fact. Marco had been Nano's supplier for decades: pasta, olive oil, cured meats. A family friend, and more importantly, a conspirator. He moved through the dining room easily, exchanging hugs and warm greetings like a long-lost uncle. My parents barely noticed him, just another small-time grocer in their eyes. Marco reached me at the kitchen pass and handed over a slim envelope. All set, he whispered. As planned. You've got this. I nodded and tucked the envelope into the inside pocket of my chef's coat. The final piece of Nano's plan now resting over my heart. We cleaned up quickly after the breakfast rush. The dining room looked pristine again by the time we left for the law office. The firm of Harrison and Bellini was located on the top floor of a marble and glass tower downtown. The receptionist led us into a walnut-paneled conference room that smelled faintly of lemon oil and power. My parents sat at one end, flanked by their attorneys' suits sharp enough to slice parmesan. I took my place at the other end, alone but calm. Mr. Harrison, a kindly man with snowy white hair and a voice like sandpaper, greeted us all and placed a thick manila folder in front of him. Thank you for coming, he began. Your father Giovanni. Romano left very specific instructions on how this reading should proceed. He pulled out a smaller envelope. First, he asked that you all watch a video message. A staffer dimmed the lights and rolled in a monitor. The screen lit up with a familiar face: Nano, filmed just 3 months earlier. He looked older than I remembered, but his eyes danced with that same mischief that used to make me laugh as a child. If you're watching this, he began with a wry smile, then everything is moving as I hoped. Robert, Maria, you're probably feeling very proud of yourselves right now. Big restaurants, big profits. You think you've won, but you've forgotten the most important lesson I ever tried to teach you. A restaurant isn't just a business. It's a home, it's family, it's heart. My father sat forward. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Sophia never forgot. Nano continued, his voice steady. That's why she's here. She helped me prepare one last recipe, a dish best served with perfect timing. What the hell is he talking about? My mother muttered, eyes narrowing. Let's continue, Mr. Harrison said, clicking off the monitor. Giovanni's instructions require we now proceed with the reading of the will. He opened the folder and began. To my daughter Maria and son-in-law Robert, I leave my wine collection, approximately worth 50. Oh, that's it? My father blurted. Mr. Harrison held up a second sheet. To my granddaughter Sophia Romano, I leave the following. Full ownership of all properties currently leased by Romano Steakhouse Group. Complete termination of said leases effective immediately. Controlling interest in Romano Hospitality Holdings. My mother stood up so quickly her chair skidded. This has to be a mistake. It's not, Mr. Harrison said, sliding over documents. Giovanni retained ownership of every location and leased them personally to your company. Your contracts are now void. I reached into my coat and pulled out the envelope from Marco. Here, I said, placing it on the table. Documents of every health code violation, every supplier kickback, labor violations, tax discrepancies, all compiled by Nano. My father went pale. You investigated us? My mother asked, breathless. No, I said, steady. He did. While you were busy growing an empire, he was watching it rot from the inside. The silence in the conference room was sharp enough to cut through steel. My parents sat frozen, their lawyers scrambling through the documents I had just handed over. My father's face turned a shade of gray I hadn't seen before, half shock, half fury. You can't do this, he muttered, gripping the edge of the table. This is fraud. Mr. Harrison, calm as ever, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. On the contrary, Mr. Romano, your father was meticulous. He never transferred ownership of the buildings to the corporation. He held them privately. Every lease your business signed was with him personally. My mother scoffed. Then we'll renegotiate the leases. Mr. Harrison slid over a stamped document. I'm afraid that's not possible. As of this morning, all leases have been terminated with cause. Per the health and labor violations documented in this packet, he gestured to my envelope. Giovanni exercised his right to void the contracts immediately. My father's lawyer leaned in to whisper something, but the color draining from his face told me the truth. The contracts were airtight, but that wasn't the final blow. There's more, Mr. Harrison continued, pulling out one final document. Giovanni also assigned Sophia his majority shares in Romano Hospitality Holdings. Effective immediately, she owns 51% of the company. She is now the majority shareholder and controlling voice in all corporate decisions. My mother stood again, this time in a mix of disbelief and anger. He gave everything to her? After everything we built? After everything we sacrificed? You didn't build it, I said quietly. You stole it. You took Nano's trattoria, stripped out his recipes, swapped handmade pasta for frozen shortcuts, and turned his legacy into a machine. He asked you to preserve it. You chose profits over purpose. My father's voice cracked. We made it successful. You made it soulless. Their lawyer tried to argue the contracts were unenforceable, that Nano couldn't dictate terms of ownership based on tradition and cooking quality. But Mr. Harrison was ready for that too. Actually, he said, tapping a paragraph in the original sale agreement, he could. Giovanni included a clause that specifically required the restaurant maintain its original values: ingredient quality, cooking methods, customer service standards. The moment you abandoned those, ownership reverted to him or his designated heir. That's Sophia. I watched their lawyers deflate. The fight had gone out of them. I stood slowly and opened a separate folder of my own. Here's what I'm offering. Both my parents looked up in stunned silence. You can retain management of 3 restaurant locations, I said, if you agree to return to Nano's original standards. Fresh ingredients, handmade dishes, real service, everything made from scratch. My mother blinked. And the other locations? They'll be closed for renovation. rebranded as La Tavola di Nonno. I'll reopen them under the brand Nonno always wanted to preserve. My father's jaw tightened. And if we refuse, then I shut them all down tomorrow. I own the properties. I own the company. There's nothing you can do to stop it. For the next hour, they huddled with their lawyers, voices low and intense. I didn't rush them. The silence didn't bother me. The outcome was already sealed. Nonno had made sure of it. When they returned to the table, my father looked 10 years older. We'll accept the offer, he said, barely able to meet my eyes. 3 locations. You'll start next week, I said, already standing. Marco will oversee the ingredient deliveries, and I'll be reviewing each menu personally. My mother's expression was unreadable. Not anger, not sadness, something more complicated. Regret, maybe. I hope you remember how to roll pasta by hand, I added softly. That evening, back at the restaurant, the dinner service was vibrant. The dining room was packed, not with curiosity seekers, but with friends and family who'd supported us through the illusion of failure. Marco met me at the kitchen door with a wink. You should have seen their faces. I did, I said, smiling. Every wrinkle of disbelief. He held up a bottle of wine. Nonno's last vintage, saved for tonight. We poured a few glasses and toasted in the kitchen, where Nonno's spirit still lived in every spice jar and copper pan. Staff clinked glasses, laughed, wiped away tears. It wasn't just my victory. It was ours. After the rush, I walked the floor. The lights were dimmed, the tables empty. My copper coffee pot gleamed on the stove, still warm. I brewed a fresh batch of Nonno's special blend. Then, like some storybook ending, my parents walked through the door. Their designer coats gone, their expressions subdued. They approached Nonno's table and sat down quietly. Coffee? I asked. They nodded. I poured. For a long moment, none of us said anything. He planned this, my mother whispered finally. Every step. He was preparing. You all along. Wasn't he? Yes, I said. And giving you one last chance to remember who you were before the money. My father took a sip, eyes closed. I forgot how good this coffee was. That's the thing about tradition, I said, refilling their cups. It waits, sometimes quietly, sometimes with a vengeance. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. I spent every morning at Bella Cucina, overseeing breakfast service, and every afternoon in one of the 15 restaurants I now controlled, tasting sauces, inspecting kitchens, interviewing staff, and slowly stripping away years of corporate shortcuts. We started with the signage. Romano's Steakhouse came down, one by one, replaced with polished wooden plaques that read La Tavola di Nonno, Nonno's table. I wanted everyone who walked through those doors to feel what Nonno had taught me to create. Warmth, welcome, and memory in every bite. The transition wasn't easy. Some staff were resistant, clinging to frozen entrees and pre-portioned sauces like life rafts. Others, usually the older chefs, welcomed it with tears in their eyes. They had worked for my grandfather before the corporate takeover. They remembered what the food used to taste like. At a T1 location in San Mateo, I found an old pasta roller buried in a back closet. The chef there, a woman named Jana, hadn't used it in years. When I asked her to dust it off, she ran her fingers over the wood like it was a lost friend. I thought we weren't allowed to do this anymore, she said. You are now, I replied. We're not running a factory, we're running a kitchen, and the change began. Meanwhile, my parents were adapting to their new reality reluctantly. I assigned them the 3 original locations they'd built after convincing Nonno to sell. It was symbolic. They would have to work daily in the places where their betrayal began. To their credit, they didn't complain. At least, not to my face. My mother returned to managing the floor, something she hadn't done in years. My father, stripped of boardrooms and spreadsheets, donned a white apron, and Ray learned how to make marinara from scratch. I watched them closely, not to punish, but to ensure they didn't cut corners. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about redemption. Still, some moments felt surreal, like the night I walked into the Palo Alto branch unannounced and found my father standing over a simmering pot, stirring slowly, his brow furrowed with concentration. Taste, he said, handing me a wooden spoon. I did. The sauce was good. Not perfect, but close. You're almost there, I said. He nodded. Giovanni used to say, you cook it with your hands, but flavor it with your heart. I didn't understand that until recently. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. A month after the transition began, we held the grand reopening of Bella Cucina. But But this wasn't just a celebration, it was a declaration. The dining room was packed. Longtime patrons, former employees of Nano's old family friends, and even food critics had made reservations weeks in advance. The aroma of freshly baked focaccia and slow-roasted lamb filled the air. Jazz played softly in the background, and candlelight flickered against the copper fixtures. Nano had loved so much. I wore Nano's chef whites that night, the ones he'd worn when he opened his first trattoria in 1965. I didn't cook. That was Marco's job now. But I made the coffee. When I brought out the copper pot, the entire dining room hushed. This, I said, standing near Nano's old table, is a pot that brewed more than just coffee. It brewed conversations, forgiveness, love, and tonight, I hope it reminds you of what dining used to feel like before we rushed everything. Before we forgot, the applause was soft, respectful. Then the conversations resumed, richer than ever. My parents sat at a small table in the back watching, not as guests of honor, but as two people relearning what family meant. My mother smiled at me from across the room. For the first time in years, it didn't feel forced. As the evening wound down, a man approached me, late 50s, sharp suit, smooth voice. You're Sophia? I am. Name's Leonard Bear. I'm with the West Coast Culinary Alliance. We give out awards for culinary restoration, heritage cooking, that sort of thing. Your restaurant has been nominated for the Tradizioni Award. I blinked. You're joking. I don't joke about pasta, he said, grinning, after he left. I found myself alone at Nano's table. I sat, poured a final cup of coffee, and took it all in. The low hum of conversation, the clink of silverware, the way people lingered, not wanting to leave. That's how I knew we'd succeeded. We hadn't just won, we'd healed. Later that night, I stepped into the kitchen and found Marco packing up. You ever think Nano planned this way before the will? He asked. Every day, I replied. He leaned on the counter. And now we rebuild, I said. Not just buildings or menus, but trust, tradition, legacy. He raised his eyebrows. And your parents? They're learning, I said, looking out the kitchen window at their silhouettes in the dining room. One sauce at a time. Exactly 1 year after the will reading, Bella Cucina stood at the center of a culinary renaissance. What had once been a struggling family restaurant was now the flagship of a revitalized empire, La Tavola di Nano, with 10 thriving locations, each echoing the values Nano Geppa had cherished: fresh ingredients, tradition, and treating every guest like family. I stood behind the pass, watching servers sweep across the room with steaming plates of handmade gnocchi, lemon-scented sea bass, and braised short ribs cook low and slow. Laughter rolled through the dining room. Not the stiff, awkward kind you'd hear in corporate eateries, but the genuine warmth of people sharing stories over good food. Nano had always said, you don't cook to impress people, you cook to remind them they're loved. And tonight, that love filled every corner of Bella Cucina. My mother worked the pasta station. Her once manicured hands now bore the soft calluses of someone who kneads dough daily. She had gone from sneering at flour-dusted aprons to wearing one herself, a simple white bib with the words handmade with love embroidered across it. The first time I saw her cry over perfectly shaped ravioli, I knew something inside her had shifted. My father was at the front of the house, greeting regulars by name, seating couples with anniversary flowers, telling stories about Geppa like they were his own. Gone was the businessman obsessed with quarterly margins. In his place stood a man who had once been a boy peeling garlic at Nano's elbow. They had changed, not because I forced them, but because Nano had orchestrated a reckoning wrapped in forgiveness. And me? I had stopped trying to prove anything to them. I no longer needed their approval. I had earned something better, their respect. The Culinary Alliance dinner came 3 months later. I wore a simple black dress and tucked a photo of Nano into my clutch. When our restaurant's name was called for the Tradizioni Award, I stepped on stage with tears already threatening. People often ask why I chose to bring back outdated methods. I said to the silent room, why go backwards when the world is moving forward? I held up the photo of Nano, because progress means nothing if you forget where you came from. This, I gestured to the image, is my compass. He built restaurants with soul, and I hope I've honored him by returning to that. The applause that followed was thunderous. That night, back at Bella Cucina, the whole team waited. Marco, Gianna, my parents, the staff, everyone who had fought to keep Nano's legacy alive. We popped a bottle of Prosecco in the kitchen, surrounded by steam and simmering sauces. I poured us all a glass and raised mine. To Nano, I said. And to the dish he always believed in most, redemption. Salute, echoed the room, and then I brewed coffee. I carried the copper pot to Nano's table, now permanently reserved. Beside it sat an engraved plaque, in loving memory of Geppa Romano, chef, mentor. Nano. I poured 3 cups and brought them to the table where my parents waited, quieter than usual. My mother cradled hers gently. He'd be proud of you, she said, eyes glistening. He'd be proud of all of us, I replied. My father took a sip, then chuckled. Still tastes like home. Over the next few months, we expanded again, but slowly, carefully. No investors, no shortcuts. Every new location had to meet 3 rules: fresh ingredients only. Every recipe approved by our team of traditional chefs. Every manager had to work 2 weeks at Bella Cucina first to understand what this was all really about. The press called it a return to roots movement. We just called it family. One morning, I walked into our newest location in Napa and found my father kneeling to clean a scuff off a wooden table. He looked up, smiled sheepishly. He always said the table should be clean enough to eat on before the plate even arrived. He did, I said, and helped him finish wiping it down. That afternoon, he asked if we could bring back Jeppa's original espresso tart. Think people would like it? They already love it, I said. They just don't know it yet. The biggest surprise came on a quiet Sunday morning. My mother approached me in the Bella Cucina kitchen, holding a notebook. I found this in one of Jeppa's old drawers, she said. It's his original cookbook, his handwriting, notes, corrections. He even listed the name of every server who worked his opening night. I flipped through the pages. There were oil stains, tomato splashes, even a few burns on the corners, and it smelled faintly of cinnamon. This isn't just a cookbook, she whispered. It's his story. We'll frame it, I said, and maybe use it to write our next chapter. 1 year later, I stood at the edge of the dining room, watching as a young chef rolled pasta at the window table. The copper pot gleamed on the stovetop, steam curling into the air, and the bell above the door chimed softly. A little girl walked in holding her father's hand. She looked up at the walls, the flickering candles, and the smell of something roasting in red wine. Then, she smiled and said, "Daddy, it smells like love in here." And in that moment, I knew Nano had finally come home.